Hi, welcome to the 6th broadcast of State of the Arts. This is a Facebook Live event, and it's about exploring the humanities and social sciences here at Memorial University. And it's a monthly program. We chat with a variety of faculty members about their work and how their research and teaching looks at issues of our changing world, and how we can delve into the questions that are going to make us better human beings. And today my guest is Dr. Sonja Boon, and I'm really honored to have you here. Sonja is a professor in the Department of Gender Studies, and she researches in the areas of feminist theory, life writing, auto-ethnography, and women's history. At a broad level, her work considers the intersection between life writing, bodies, citizenship, and theory. And Dr. Boon is also a professional flautist who has performed and recorded as a soloist, chamber, and orchestral musician across North America as well as Europe and Japan. So welcome, Sonja.
Thanks.
Now, as I understand it, you have, before the age of 6, you had visited, you fill in anything I leave out, France, the Netherlands, Italy, Suriname, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Curacao, Colombia, the U.S., Argentina, Trinidad, and Tobago.
Yeah.
Did I leave anything out?
You might have, but I wouldn't be able to keep track.
And your mother was from Suriname, and your father was Dutch. You were born in the UK, and your sister was born in Canada. Is that right?
Yes.
And you came to Newfoundland in 2008. Did you come for the first time for a job interview here at Memorial?
I did, in fact. I came in the deep, dark depths of February, and the rain was horizontal, sometimes vertical the other way around. And so the weather was madness, complete madness, but that's okay. That's when I arrived. It was for a job interview. It was the first time I'd ever been here.
And I read that I was reading about your description of the weather, and you're such a beautiful writer. And you said, looking out that window, it looked like the rain was going upside down.
It absolutely was. I had never experienced rain that went in the opposite direction. It was the first time.
And I think that's a just really beautiful description of what can happen out there. I want to start with auto-ethnography. Can you tell us what auto-ethnography is?
So the way I would normally tell students what auto-ethnography is, it is a really ethnography of the self. So it's using the self as the site of the research, right? Putting your body where your reason is how one scholar put it. So you're really looking at what happens when you interview yourself, when you interrogate your own memories, when you interrogate your own understandings of things, and how can you use that as a way into thinking about various different kinds of theoretical questions. There are various things that I could never ask anybody else to talk about, right? It's impossible to ask anybody else to talk about that, but I can ask myself to talk about those things, right? I can ask myself ways into those things. There are questions that perhaps that I need to examine, and I can only examine inside my own body. Like there's certain embodied experiences that I can only get at because I'm looking at it myself. So it's using the self as a basis for looking at larger, broader social, cultural, philosophical, theoretical concerns.
And one of the things that you have explored about yourself is a wild traveling history that goes back through time. And you've done that through the archives, and you write beautifully about archives, and you talk about how they can illuminate and give us all kinds of information, but also how they can be opaque, and what they can leave out, and how they can be deceptive, because when we're reading them, it feels like we're getting the full story. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So this current project, what I was interested in was complicated belonging. So how it is that sometimes where you fit in it's not as easy as it looks on the surface. So what I'm looking at is larger and longer family histories. And I went into the archives because I love the archives. I love the traces that people leave of themselves in various ways. In the past, I've worked with letters, and letters in some ways they're lovely and generous and juicy and filled with all sorts of stuff, right? Because you're getting the person who's written the letter themselves, and they're revealing bits of themselves to the person they're writing to. But in this current project, I don't have letters, right? My ancestors were not people who necessarily had literary skills of any sort. They were not able to write, many of them. They didn't have access to writing implements of any sort. They didn't have the capacity to do this. So they only appear in government documents. They appear in documents created about them, right? In other documents. And so I don't have, in those cases, so for example, one part of my family history appears in Plantation Registers. These are registers that were constructed because plantation owners, they knew that slavery was going to end, and they wanted compensation for losing the people that they had enslaved, the work of that. So they created lists of all the people that they had enslaved, and among those are some of my ancestors. It's great to find their names. It's totally traumatic to find their names, but it's great to find them. But I can't ever in that area find their own voices, because these were documents created about them by wealthy people who owned them. And so the missing bit is that I will never have the stories in their own voices. Those juicy letters, they don't exist. There's no diary, there's none of that personal stuff. It's just a name, and then possibly a mother's name, possibly the job they have, but that's it. And so in certain documents, we have to think about the archives as largely having existing because people with a lot of privilege had stuff to keep and holding on to them. And that means that people who didn't have a lot of privilege often get lost in there. Sometimes you can find them inadvertently, by accident, but often they disappear.
So in your book, Water Music, which has the subtitle
Travels in Search of Ancestry, Belonging, and Home, and I'm going to make a shout out to the editor that I was working with, because without her, it would be still titleless today.
There's so many things I want to talk about this book with you. I want to ask you. One of the things that you have a page of names of slaves.
Yes.
And it is heartbreaking to read that. You know, I teared up. Tell me why you included all those names.
I included them, and this was part of my own process, because when I went into the archives, I went in with my academic voice. I thought, okay, I've got to go into the archives and just be an academic researcher, right? So I went in there, and I found the things, and I put things away, and I thought, wait a sec, but I've missed so much of the story if I don't sit down and I really think about who these people are. Because these people, who were they? Who were the 300 odd people at that plantation? I need to account for them. I need to, and what I write needs to account for them, and they need to be present, and that's the only way they can be present is in their names, because nothing else exists of them other than the names that are in that register. And if I can write their names down, then they become that much more real, right? They are not just, it's not just this random document. This is actually, these are the people that were enslaved in that place. And if I write down their names, it is hard. It is hard to go through all those names and to write every single one down and to think, who were these people? But each name is a person with a life and a history and loves and passions and joys and fears, each person. But in many cases, all we have is that name. And all we have, in many cases, only just a first name. That's it. And if I didn't put their name down, they wouldn't exist at all in the story, and I don't think that would be fair.
And it's beautiful that you did, and I thank you for it. One of the things that you were talking about there is going in there with your academic lens, or a kind of carapace or armor, I think, to approaching archives that I understand from what you've written you weren't expecting to hit you in the way that they did. You were addressing ethical questions, you were addressing emotional questions, and very personal questions, as it turned out. So I'm wondering if that experience or other experiences in your life led you to question what it means to be an academic, what that kind of writing means, because the sort of writing that you're doing is not what we normally think of, or not the cliche of academic writing, which is considered to be sometimes, not, of course, these rules are being broken all over the place, but often objective, in a dry, clear, crisp, clean, unemotional language. But you're writing something that is actually incredibly poetic and charged with emotion. And
So
from the self.
Yeah, so I will say, I'll start off by saying that I think it is important to have many different avenues into. And so what I can call the traditional scholarly voice is absolutely important. And I drew a lot on secondary sources critical scholarly secondary sources that write in that very traditional academic way. But I also really found, the more I got into this research, that one thing that I hadn't, as a researcher, spent enough time accounting for was the role of vulnerability of the researcher, the role of the emotion of the researcher, and the role of emotion itself in constructing knowledge. That it's easy in many conventional approaches to research to think, well, we're all objective. Our work is all objective. It's all together. But in this, and I had encountered some archival work before where I thought, okay, I have to really figure out where I sit. But this was the first time where it really hit me hard, where I thought, okay, I can't just say that I'm an emotionally disengaged researcher, because the emotion is the research in this particular case. The archives are a source, but my emotional response to them is also a source, and it's a source that I have to take seriously, because it's affecting things in various sorts of ways. And what's it mean to be a researcher? Because we're all embodied beings as researchers. We're not just automatons. Otherwise, robots could do our work for us. We could program them and off they go. But we're all embodied beings. That's part of what brings our passion to our work. It's part of what makes us researchers. And so I really wanted to explore that, and I felt that the traditional venue of traditional scholarly work, traditional scholarly book, wouldn't work. And so that's why I worked in this particular, water music is a different venue.
And you had this whole life as a musician, which of course I don't imagine that has gone away, before you became an academic. And do you think, how did that influence what you're studying and how you're writing and all of that? Does it?
It absolutely does. It still influences it today. The big thing that it influences is my interest in bodies and embodiment, because so much of being a musical performer is about knowing in your body, right? So as a flute player, I can tell you where sound sits. I can tell you exactly where like a C or whatever fits in my body. I know where that resonates. I know where the sound comes from. I can't draw that for you on a chart and say, here biologically this is what's happening, but I know exactly where that fits inside my body. I know how the flute feels. I know what it feels like when an audience is with you or when they're not with you. And all of that is embodied. So that whole experience of embodiment as a musician, absolutely, that completely shaped my entry into, when I first started researching, it was in 18th century studies. I was working in 18th century music. I understand 18th century society through my experience with 18th century music. Mm-hmm. That has been my window in. And it still continues to be that way now. It affects the kinds of assignments I assign to my students. It affects the way that I think about how we move through the world is just as a musician.
And part of this exploration that you've done with the archives and with your book, based on the archives, the water music, is about the idea of home, which is, I think, the last word in your subtitle.
Yes.
And you have talked about people in Newfoundland saying, "Where are you from?" And that is such a loaded and difficult question for many people. What can you tell me about that question? Both how you answer it yourself and for yourself, and how it feels to be asked that question, and what it means to be here.
So I guess the book itself really ends up becoming trying to figure out the answer to where are you from, to that question, right? And moving to Newfoundland was the first time that I really started. I've been asked that question I don't know how many times since I was little. But moving to Newfoundland, where place is so important to so many people here, and where people ask it quite regularly, I really started thinking, okay, so what does that mean? What does home actually mean, right? I'm in a place where, for the first time, most of my students have a very clear visual understanding exactly of what home is, right? And they know exactly, they can pinpoint it. They know exactly what the bedspread looks like. Home is so, and they know where it is. They know what it smells like, what it feels like. So that made me start thinking about that and saying, okay, so what does home actually mean to me? And that's when I started thinking, okay, so this is why I started thinking about complicated belongings. Can we belong in ways that are beyond a singular home? What might that look like? How might that complicate understandings of multiculturalism that are premised on this notion of home being you're from here and then you come to Canada? But suppose you're from here, 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 and here. What does that mean? And how do we live with that? How do we live with long legacies that are legacies of oppression, right? So how do we live with afterlives of slavery? How do we live with the afterlives of indenture, both of which are in my family histories? What are my responsibilities to those histories in my life today? what do they mean to how I understand home today? And I can't say that when somebody says, where are you from, right? Like, how long do you have? Right? I can't say that, right? Because they want it sort of an easy answer, because they don't think they're going to get a giant dissertation on home and belonging. And so I think one thing Newfoundland has had me do is think about that in more complicated ways than perhaps that I had consciously done before that point.
And you've talked about Middle Cove.
Yes,
Middle
I
Cove
love
Beach.
Middle Cove.
Yes, and you see it as a kind of, well, I mean, you've talked about islands. Can you talk about islands for me and tell me what they mean as, well, just the beach, I guess, as a liminal space, or a space where things are in flux.
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways I feel presumptuous talking about islands as someone who's lived on one for 10 years. As opposed to generations. But what really does strike me about islands is that space between water and land, and that space is constantly moving. It's constantly shifting. If you go to Middle Cove Beach, it's always the same thing. It's always moving. It's never the same. The beach stones, they're always in a different place, right? There are hills and valleys in different places, and all sorts of things come and go at the beach, right? And the beach is a point of encounter, not just between peoples who come from water to land or from land to water, but also an encounter of sort of rocks and water. So the non-human things that encounter one another. There's so much that happens in this space at the water's edge. Really, there's so much that happens in that space. And there's so much mixture that's happening there, right? So this spring I was in Trinity. I took off with a friend to have 3 few days of writing. We were right there at the water, and every time the tide came in and out, I would go out and play amateur archaeologist, much to her irritation, because she's a real archaeologist. And I would go poking around and see what I could find. And every time there was something new. Something new had revealed itself. And that's the thing that's interesting to me about the water's edge, is that the stories are constantly moving. They're constantly shifting. There's new ones emerging and other ones that submerge, and I find that fascinating.
Thank you so much, Sonja. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to, before we go, we're both going to plug our upcoming events. So you begin. We only do events that begin with M. So, Sonja.
I'm doing a talk next week at the Center for Music, Media, and Plays, 2 M's and a P. It's next Thursday night at 7:30. And it's a talk called Minuet as Method, and it's about embodied research. So it's everybody will learn how to dance a minuet if you come to that talk, and it's free.
And I believe you will learn how to dance a minuet. I am one of the coordinators, along with Steve Crocker and Claire Neal, who are putting off a conference about Muskrat Falls here at the university. It's in the engineering building, in the room 2006, and you'll hear everything you need to know about Muskrat Falls at that conference. So it's the 28th and 29th. In the evening on the 28th is a panel about art and resistance, and all day on the 29th. Free parking, everybody is welcome, and it's free. Thank you so much. I'm so excited that we're back with State of the Arts.
Yay!
Yay! Thank you, Sonja.
Thank you.